A quick disclaimer before we get into the rest of the video. This was originally made as a final project for my Rhetoric of Games class that I took a couple of years ago. So you'll notice that it is very different from my typical content, not only in terms of visuals, but I tend to focus a bit more on like the Rhetoric of Games as the class was for. So I think if I were to make this video again today, I would have approached it a little bit more differently because there is very much that sort of underlying academic tone to it. But I also feel like because I did it a little bit last minute, there are things I could have researched a bit better, and I think there are things that I possibly could have worded better, especially when there is discussion of gender and race. But I still think there was a lot of valuable discussion that happens in this video, and I wanted to put it out there because I haven't been able to make any new content for y'all in the past couple of months due to technical issues on my end. So I hope you enjoy, and please let me know if there's any misinformation or things I misspoke on, because I want to hold myself accountable if there are things in this video that don't read as well. But with that disclaimer out of the way, I hope you enjoy. Undertale is a game that has had an incredible impact on many people, including myself. It was the game that really got me interested in video games and led me to want to study game design like I am now. There are many elements throughout the game that make it an engaging and compelling interactive story experience. However, one particularly fascinating element is Frisk's role as a protagonist and what they represent, both as a character and as part of an overarching narrative. There are two questions I aim to answer in this video regarding Frisk as a character. Number 1, is Frisk an example of non-binary representation? And 2, how does Frisk's race factor into the game's narrative? Without further ado, let's get into it. Throughout the game, characters refer to Frisk using they-them pronouns. This is commonplace in games where the player character's gender is unknown as a means of making the narrative more inclusive and up for interpretation. However, Frisk is not merely referred to using they-them pronouns for this purpose. They canonically use those pronouns to represent themselves. There is still some debate within the community as to whether or not Frisk is canonically non-binary. Quickly searching for this answer, I found multiple threads on Reddit, Tumblr, and Twitter with people saying that Toby confirmed that Frisk is canonically non-binary. However, he has never explicitly stated this. He has said in multiple interviews that Frisk's gender is up to the player's interpretation and that they do not have a canon gender. So, does this mean Frisk isn't non-binary? Not exactly. Something a lot of people get confused about is that non-binary doesn't always mean someone doesn't have a gender. That definition applies to a specific non-binary identity known as agender. It is often that people will use the term non-binary when they really mean agender, likely because the former is a more recognizable term. But as I mentioned before, agender is just one identity that falls under the non-binary umbrella. The actual definition of non-binary gender, according to Merriam-Webster, is relating to or being a person who identifies with or expresses a gender identity that is neither entirely male nor entirely female. Frisk not having a canon gender identity and their gender changing depending on each player does fit this definition. So although Toby has not explicitly stated that Frisk is non-binary, they still fall in that category. Having a non-binary protagonist at first seems like great representation. However, as mentioned previously, they-them pronouns are not an automatic indicator of this. Because the player base of video games as a whole is dominated by white males, and the fact that a non-binary identity might not be something the average player is familiar with, they might not even consider the fact that Frisk is a non-binary character and instead project their own interpretation of their gender onto them. Because the creator of the game encourages this by leaving Frisk's gender up to interpretation, the player essentially gets to choose what they want Frisk's gender to be. One of the many struggles that the trans community faces is misgendering and being told what their gender should be. Allowing the largely cisgender gaming community to dictate a character's gender seems antithetical to that character serving as non-binary representation. In Simulacra and Simulations by Jean Baudrillard, he summarizes 3 orders of simulation. One of these orders of simulation is a simulation that creates its own reality. Baudrillard explains that this order is characterized by a kind of hyper-reality in which the simulation becomes more real than reality itself. Examining Frisk's gender from this perspective supports Toby Fox's statements about it being up to the player's interpretation. Since Frisk merely represents a human child of uncertain gender, whatever reality the player decides makes up that gender becomes that reality. To them, Frisk is whatever gender they have assigned to them. Thus, if that player does not consider the fact that they are a non-binary character, it is more difficult for them to accept after experiencing the game where they have already adopted the gender they assigned Frisk as truth. That being said, Frisk still challenges the gender binary and gender expression as a non-binary protagonist. While this could have been executed in a way that better serves its representation, it is not to entirely discredit their portrayal as a character that does not conform to gender norms. In the practice of everyday life, Michael Descerteaux explains that in a bustling, ever-changing environment like the city, it can seem impossible to overcome the systems of power and control it enforces. However, simply walking through the city, an individual can forge their own path outside of these systems, challenging and possibly transforming the systems that shape urban life. As a non-binary character, Frisk challenges the system of gender that is dominant in our society and takes the player for a walk outside of these norms. Frisk is depicted with yellow skin, which is likely intended to be a way to make them racially ambiguous and allows a wide variety of player base to more easily imagine themselves in Frisk's shoes throughout the story. Characters being depicted with yellow skin is not a new or unique practice. Other properties such as LEGO and The Simpsons use yellow skin for their characters. However, this does not extend to characters of color. They are still depicted as having a natural skin tone alongside their yellow-skinned peers. We can see this in the Star Wars Cloud City set, in which white characters like Luke Skywalker and Han Solo have yellow skin, while Lando Calrissian does not. Throughout The Simpsons, a show that is incredibly recognizable by the character's yellow skin, we also see characters like Carl Carlson having their natural dark skin tones. In these examples, yellow skin essentially replaces lighter skin within these universes. However, when examining Undertale, this doesn't seem to be the case. Although Frisk is depicted with yellow skin, Kara, the only other human we see portrayed throughout the game, has a natural light skin tone, meaning these same rules do not apply to the Undertale universe. This means that Frisk and Kara do not necessarily have different skin tones. It's actually quite possible that the opposite may be true. While it seems like the intention of giving Frisk yellow skin was to make them racially ambiguous, an important part of Undertale's narrative is the parallels between Frisk and Kara. Frisk is confused for Kara throughout the story by not only the monsters within the game, but by us as players. One of the big twists of the game is that the name the player gives the fallen child at the start is not Frisk's name, but Kara's. In the prologue of the game, we see a human child fall down Mount Ebbet, and naturally we assume that this is our character. However, at the end of the game, we see the continuation of that story and learn that it is actually Kara's fall that we witnessed. But why does this matter? Well, if these two characters are meant to look so similar that they are confused throughout the game's narrative, and one of them is clearly depicted as having a lighter skin tone, it somewhat implies that the other is meant to adopt a similar skin tone. Despite the ambiguity of Frisk's natural skin tone that comes with their yellow coloring, these parallels to Kara in terms of both design and narrative almost negate that ambiguity. However, the key word here is almost. Except for their skin and the colors of their striped shirts, Frisk and Kara look incredibly similar. Monsters, who are considered one race despite their wide variety of appearances, may not be as attuned to these characteristics that distinguish humans from each other. Since these monsters are used to seeing incredible variation among their race, it wouldn't be surprising for them to assume two humans were the same person, even if to us something like skin color would make them easily distinguishable. Additionally, throughout the game, Frisk is identified not based on their physical characteristics like hair, stature, skin tone, etc., but the clothes they are wearing. Many of the monsters refer to Frisk as a human wearing a striped shirt and use that as their identifying characteristic. When traveling through Waterfall, Papyrus asks Frisk what they are wearing because that is how Undyne identified them previously. All of this is to say, Frisk's skin color and race still remain ambiguous and up to the player's interpretation. However, Frisk's race as a human has some real-world parallels and implications when examining their relationship to the monsters living in the underground. There are a lot of undertones surrounding race and who has power throughout Undertale. From the first launch of the game, the player is told the story of how two races, humans and monsters, lived on the surface before the humans, after defeating the monsters in a war, sealed them underground, never to return to the surface. Before even beginning playing the game proper, the player is informed of two races that will have an important role in the game's narrative. There is a bit of juxtaposition with the status that Frisk holds in the underground. As a human, the race that was victorious in the war and sealed the monsters underground, Frisk is put in an interesting position of being the more powerful race. However, they are also a child, and a child alone likely would be unable to stand up to the many monsters that inhabit the underground. Although humans sealed the monsters underground, those humans lived long ago, and Frisk being a child represents how far removed they are from those humans, and that they are their own person able to make their own decisions. In the context of Undertale's pacifist run, the human treating everyone with kindness and refusing to kill the monsters they face spins this message in a positive light. There is hope and possibility of change. However, when examining Undertale as a whole and the fact that the player, and in the context of the game Frisk, has complete control over the fate of the underground, reinforces how Frisk still holds that power. When the player makes it to Waterfall, they learn about a prophecy that illustrates the control that Frisk has over the underground when talking to Gerson the turtle. Legend has it, an angel who has seen the surface will descend from above and bring us freedom. Lately, the people have been taking a bleaker outlook, calling that winged circle the Angel of Death, a harbinger of destruction waiting to free us from this mortal realm. This is reinforced later by a carving on the wall explaining the prophecy as follows. The angel, the one who has seen the surface, they will return, and the underground will go empty. This prophecy gives context to the pacifist and genocide runs of the game. The underground will either go empty because the monsters leave it to live on the surface, or the bleaker outlook that Gerson mentions will come true, in which the Angel of Death kills every monster living underground. It is readily apparent that Frisk is the angel in this prophecy, and the player decides which route the angel will take, one of mercy or one of bloodshed. Frisk ultimately has control over the fate of the underground. It is entirely up to them to determine which outcome will come to fruition. In this universe, Frisk belongs to the dominant race of the planet. Humans sealed the monsters underground after attacking the monsters and starting the war no less, and those humans now have a population of billions. In comparison, the monsters living in the underground have a minuscule population. They are a racial minority. If we draw parallels from this story to the real world, the message of Undertale can be interpreted as how the racial majority, though they can be advocates of positive change, ultimately have the control and power to decide what role the minorities will play in society. These minorities can fight back, defend their way of living, and make efforts to change the future, but if the majority decides that they want to make a drastic change, they have the ability to do so. This underlying message is part of what makes Undertale so impactful. Its juxtaposition of the pacifist and genocide roots and the player's ability to decide that outcome entirely on their own not only emphasizes the importance of our choices and the impact on those around us, but can also serve as a commentary on the way the white population has significant control over how racial minorities live their lives. Lisa Nakamura, co-editor of Race in Cyberspace, explains the concept of identity tourism online, a phenomenon in which people have the ability to pass as identities other than their own on the internet. Identity tourism can provide opportunities for exploration of the experiences that people within these identities face. This is common practice in online games, especially MMOs like World of Warcraft that allow character customization. Although Undertale does not take place in an online space, nor does it allow character customization, Frisk's racial ambiguity means the player can experience the game as whatever race they want and let it tailor their enjoyment. Because Frisk adopts the role of a racial majority in the context of the game, minorities who play Undertale may experience identity tourism as they adopt the power and control that Frisk wields because of their race. On the other hand, white players may use their sense of being alone and attacked for their race while playing as Frisk as a way of exploring what it feels like to be a minority. No matter what each player's interpretation of Frisk's gender or race may be, Undertale challenges what we know about both of these topics and allows us to explore different experiences through a fantasy world that encourages us to consider the impact of our choices. Thanks for watching!